Thank you very, very much. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks, as always, for the invitation to spend time with partners, friends, people who care deeply about exactly the same thing that all of us do. 5 weeks ago, on Wednesday, I was sitting in my office talking to a student at Shalem College who happened to mention that she was from Pardes Chana, little town not far from Zichron Yaakov, which is a little town not far from something else. And I asked her how her family ended up living in Pardes Chana. She said, well, my parents were born there. I said, well, why'd your parents get born there? She goes, my grandparents moved there. I said, where'd your grandparents move there from? She said, Europe. I said, oh, they met in Europe. She said, no, they didn't meet in Europe. I said, oh, they met in Israel. She goes, no, they didn't meet in Palestine or Israel. So I said, where'd they meet? She said, they actually met on the Exodus. I thought, that's cool. So I said, how did they actually meet on the Exodus? And it's one of these classic Hollywood stories, which is that his shirt got dirty, and he went down to the area where the women were. I'm sorry, this is 2015. That was a long time ago. Knowing that she would have soap, and he asked around, does anybody have soap? She said, I have soap. What do you need soap for? He said, my shirt got dirty. She said, give me your shirt. And that was the end of the story. Anyway, it's a fascinating story. They were married in Marseille. You know that the British actually deported all the people that were on the Exodus. They kept them imprisoned for a few days, mostly in Atlit, and then they loaded them back up on ships to take them back to Europe, only the British. And on the way back to Europe, the ship docked in Marseille. They got off the ship, went to a rabbi, got married, got back on the ship, and he is still living. She's passed away. And we're having this really unbelievable conversation. It's only when you work at a college in Israel can a student just come in to talk about whatever, and you end up talking about her grandparents meeting on the Exodus. But at that particular moment, I got a WhatsApp from my son-in-law, and it said 3.212. That was it. So I said to the student, it's been lovely talking to you. Out you go. Because I knew full well that that was the birth weight of my granddaughter. So, thank you very much. You can applaud all you want. I'm not the one that worked very hard that day, but in any event, so I shooed away the kid whose parents met on the Exodus. I mean, how big a deal is the Exodus when your granddaughter gets born? And went over to the hospital much more quickly, I suspect, than our kids imagined we would make it, to their displeasure. And drove over to Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, parked the car, and went to meet our newborn granddaughter. Today, several hours ago, the Supreme Court informed me that though I had just driven a few miles and gone to Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, the Supreme Court has just informed me that she actually wasn't born in Israel. I could have sworn it was Israel. I mean, all the Hebrew and all the ambulances with the names of people on the doors, only in Israel are there ambulances with the names of people on the doors. All the doctors wearing kippot and all the nurses and other doctors wearing hijabs. It looked a lot like Israel, but apparently I was wrong. I say that only partly in jest. Because the Supreme Court obviously has no dog in the fight between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's not a Supreme Court issue. And I don't imagine that Justice Kennedy, who authored the majority opinion, really saw this as determining anything about the conflict in the Middle East. He saw it as an issue of the rights of the executive branch of government. And if the executive branch of government says it does not want to declare something having to do with foreign policy, then the court says it should have the right to conduct foreign policy as it sees fit. So if a law in 2002 said that that could be imposed on the executive branch, no, says the Supreme Court, it cannot. Which only begs the question, why the objection? Doesn't say on the passport, if you get it written in, that it's Israel, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Doesn't say Jerusalem, the eternal, undivided birthplace of the Jewish people, Israel. It just says Jerusalem, or it would say Jerusalem, comma, Israel. That's objectionable, says the court to the executive branch of the government of the United States. We're told that the military option is on the table. The negotiations will go where they will go, and sanctions will go where they won't go, and it'll be a successful process or it won't. But we are reassured the military option is always on the table. Except We're told 7 days ago there's no military option. Explicitly. Google it. I mean, we probably invented Google, but you can use it. You have my permission. Just Google it. There's no military option, said the president exactly a week ago. And the president also said, just recently within the last few days, that it's getting harder and harder and harder to support Israel as long as there's no progress in the peace process. And as people are talking about whether or not there's going to be a bid for Palestinian statehood at the UN and what is the U.S. going to do, in response to that, the president said, it's getting harder and harder to support Israel as long as there's not progress. I could have sworn when I was in 4th grade that we learned that negotiations actually take place between two parties. But in this particular case, obviously, it's the Israeli intransigence, which means that there's no progress in the peace process. And that's why he says it's going to be very hard to support Israel if it comes down to it in the United Nations. This is not about this administration. This is about the Western world and the Jews. Unless you think it is anything else, what I would like to try to spend a few minutes this afternoon clarifying is the way in which this is just the latest ugly chapter in a very horrible book. And that's why we can't afford to lose this one, because ironically, it's not going to be the last one. And either we as a pro-Israel, pro-American Israeli alliance community get into the habit and understand as a way of life the work that we have to do to ensure the relationship between Israel and the decency that is America, or things are going to look very bad very, very quickly. So I want to try to demonstrate the international pattern of what's happened here over the course of time by talking about the putative map of what would become the Jewish state. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration said that Her Majesty's government looks with favor misspelled, but what are you going to do? You know, it was really that spelling that had us colonies we just couldn't take the spelling anymore. It had nothing to do with taxation or representation, just all those extra U's. It got annoying, so we made a country. Her Majesty's government looked with favor upon the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. There's no map attached to the Balfour Declaration, but subsequent maps and subsequent British negotiations in all sorts of places did have a map. And it showed that what they meant was what was going to become, it wasn't quite yet the mandate, but was going to very shortly thereafter become the British mandate, which was going to effectively include what is today Israel and Jordan. Her Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people on an enormous piece of territory, said Lord Balfour in 1917. But 4 years later, Winston Churchill had a different idea. And without talking to anybody, without consulting with the Jews, without consulting with very many people, he simply lopped off what is today Jordan and said, no, it doesn't include that. This is now a country called Transjordan. We forget that. We said, well, you know, Jordan, the rising of the sun in Jordan started around the same time, didn't it? Well, only if the rising of the sun started in 1921. We forget that the British had essentially promised an enormous swath of land to the Jewish people and then just lopped off an enormous portion of it and created a country called Transjordan. You know, when I was growing up, and I grew up in a very Ben-Gurion house. It was a kind of a labor house. I think that certain people in my family are spinning when they know that I wrote a biography of Begin, but that's what are you going to do? We were taught that Jabotinsky had this crazy song. Shtei gedot layarden zu shelanu zu gam ken. The Jordan River has two banks. This one is ours and that one is ours. That was part of that whole revisionist Zionist series of songs. And I was taught that song as, it's absurd. I mean, what were the revisionists thinking? And it was only much, much later that I realized they were actually just thinking that Lord Balfour might have had an opinion. It wasn't that God gave us both sides of the Jordan River. It wasn't that we got one and we're going to steal the other. It's just that's what the Balfour Declaration said, but not anymore. So the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish entity, is left now with whatever is left between the river and the sea. And then 1936, 1937, the Jews and the Arabs are not getting along. Thank God that's over. And the Peel Commission comes to Israel to decide, what are we going to do? And they come up with what is then, by the way, a radical idea that nobody had suggested before. Seriously, nobody had ever thought of it. We're going to actually divide up the remaining land between the Jews and the Arabs, and we're going to position the Jews where the Jews live, and we're going to give them that piece, and we're going to give the Arabs the pieces where the Arabs live. If you look at the map of the Peel Commission, therefore, all of a sudden, what was the vision of the Balfour Declaration, which included everything, including Transjordan, which is now lopped off, now becomes subdivided once again. The Jewish homeland hasn't even been created as a sovereign state, and pieces are being pulled off every time you turn around. But of course, while the Jewish community, after much deliberation and with much unhappiness, accepted the recommendations of the Peel Commission, the Arab community turned it down absolutely and began the riots of 1937. And it was the riots of 1937, plus the Jewish underground and all that transpired between 37 and 47, that finally got the British to say, enough. We're out of here. We're beaten. We're defeated. They didn't leave because they became Zionists. They didn't leave because all of a sudden they had a kind of a romantic recollection of Lord Balfour. They left because we got rid of them. And they turned, of course, the question of Palestine over to UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, which then voted on the very famous map that we all know. And we remember the pictures of the Jews huddled around their wooden radios in Europe and in New York and in the Yishuv. All these little people huddled around the radios that are the size of today, supercomputers. And then you hear, Afghanistan, no, da-da-da-da. And then somewhere in the middle of the roll call, it stops. And invariably, the video cuts to people dancing in the streets in the middle of Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, people hugging and weeping. And we see it as an enormous success, as a great victory, which, of course, in large measure, it was. But the land given to the Jews on November 29, 1947, was less than the land given to the Jews in the Peel Commission recommendation. It went from all of it, and then Jordan was taken, and then Peel took away more, and then UNSCOP and the vote of the United Nations took away even more. That's the reality of the international community's attitude to Israel. What about America's attitude to Israel? Now, America has been a great ally of Israel. We all understand that. We are here today to celebrate and to encourage and to cultivate the American-Israel relationship. But we also understand that it has never been quite as simple as some of those posters out there tell the story. In 1948, the CIA told Harry Truman in no uncertain terms not to recognize the State of Israel. The CIA and the State Department. Other things that haven't entirely changed. Because the CIA told Truman that based on its in-depth, highly professional research, the Jewish state would be able to hold out for a maximum of 2 years. And then said the CIA, you're going to have actually recognized a state that's going to go under. You're going to have committed troops to the support of that country, because if you recognize it, you got to take care of it. They're going to go down. You're going to send in troops. We're going to be back in a big mess. Don't recognize the Jewish state. Thank God Harry Truman was smarter than that. But from the very, very, very outset, the State Department, along with the CIA, was telling the President of the United States, don't get involved in that. It's only bad for us. We can fast forward to the 1950s. The 1950s, Gamal Abdel Nasser has this whole notion of pan-Arabism. And he begins to rattle his saber and say that he's going to do this and he's going to do that. Clearly, they're looking for round two after the first war that they lost. And he makes it clear that he is going to nationalize the Straits of Tiran and the Suez Canal and all of it. He's going to close the Straits of Tiran and nationalize the Suez Canal and so on and so forth. And in preparation for all of this, he signs an enormous arms deal with the Czechs, does Nasser, who promise him millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in arms. And Israel understands, even at that time under Ben-Gurion as prime minister, that whatever fledgling or fragile balance of arms there was going to be completely upended by this Czech deal. So Israel went to its natural ally. It went to President Eisenhower. And it said, look, we can't survive this. We need you to arm us. And Eisenhower refused. And he later remarked to the French prime minister that the reason he didn't want to sell arms to Israel, but there was simply no point. There's no way in the world that 1.7 million Jews can defend themselves against 40 million Arabs. It can't survive, he said. Why waste the American arms? Now, we know, by the way, that Israel got into the 56 war because the French were upset that Nasser was nationalizing the Suez Canal and closing the Straits of Tiran, which had an enormous influence on French commerce. The British also, ironically, the British had the audacity to ask Israel to send its sons to go fight on their behalf, when not long ago, of course, they had sent Jews back to Europe, back to displaced persons camps, because they wouldn't let them into Palestine. And the British spent the weeks and months after the 1956 war destroying thousands of documents so that there would be no evidence whatsoever that the British had been in collusion with Israel in the 1956 war. Israel is the Jew of the nations. If the Jew lived in Europe always wondering what he or she was going to be accused of next. Killing Jesus, they said. Voltaire said, creating Christianity. Well poisoners, usurpers. The communists said we invented capitalism, and the capitalists said we invented communism. Now we're apartheid. We're Nazi-like. We're purveyors of colonialism. If the Jew lived in Europe always knowing that the next accusation was just around the corner, what it meant to be a Jew in Europe is what it means to be the state of Israel in the international community. The next assault on you is simply coming from somewhere else. That's what this Iranian issue is all about. It is part of a large string of trimming down the borders, of making the state and the territory smaller and smaller and smaller and less defensible. And this is the ultimate, making the territory simply not defensible. The worst part of the Six-Day War was before June. The worst part of the Six-Day War was in May 1967, when it was clear once again that Nasser was going to close the Straits of Tiran, and actually then did close them, and that it was going to take over the Suez Canal. And in return for getting out of Sinai in 1956, after hundreds of Israeli boys had died, by the way, it was a quick war and a relatively simple one, but hundreds of Israeli boys died, and hundreds of Israeli families were never the same. And France promised Israel, if you get out this time, if you are ever threatened again, or if the Straits of Tiran are closed, or if the Suez Canal is closed to you, you have an absolute right to defend yourselves, and we will back you on it. So in May 1967, when it becomes clear that war is inevitable, Abba Eban hops on a plane and goes first to France to meet with de Gaulle. And de Gaulle says, this issue has to be resolved non-militarily, and the parties have to be France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union was busy telling Syria that Israel was about to attack. De Gaulle knew that. De Gaulle understood that Syria was trying to get war to break out, that the Soviet Union was trying to get war to break out. And de Gaulle, therefore, cynically tells Abba Eban, well, I can't support you unless you can get Russia to agree. I.e., whatever promise I made to you in 1956, you can forget about it. And then he said Israel had better not be the ones to shoot first. And when Eban pointed out to him, in his undoubtedly mellifluous English, that the French had specifically promised in 1956 that if exactly this scenario unfolded, you would guarantee our right to self-defense, de Gaulle said, 1967 is not 1956. Those were his exact words. I.e., promises to you make no difference. The military option's on the table. There's no military option. We're going to have your back at the UN. Well, we're not making progress in the peace talks, probably because of you. You can defend yourselves if it ever happens again. Well, 56 isn't 67. In 1981, after Menachem Begin attacked the nuclear reactor in Iraq, he called Sam Lewis, the American ambassador to Israel, and told him what had just happened. And Lewis knew that the president was going to be livid. And he said, are you sure there's nothing else you want me to convey to the president? I guess, like, I'm really sorry, we didn't really mean it. You know, we had 8 jets, they saw a reactor, they bombed it, but I mean, who knew? Lewis says to Begin, there's nothing else you want me to tell the president? And Begin said, no. And how did the United States respond? Well, let's look at American non-governmental things. The New York Times called it, quote, an act of inexcusable and short-sighted aggression. Joseph Kraft, writing in the Los Angeles Times, likened the attacks to Arafat's terrorism, and he said, quote, Americans need not be afraid to point out that the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, looks no more prone to terrorist attacks than does Menachem Begin. What we are facing now is simply a continuation of what has been a vicious and unrelenting drive on the part of parts of Europe and certain powers in the United States to constantly keep Israel on the defensive. But not supplying Israel with arms in 1956, if you're France, is not the end of the world, because there are other countries to which Israel can turn if it has to. And not giving Israel the approval retroactively that it would have liked to have had about Osirak in June 1981 isn't the end of the world, because, by the way, in the Gulf War, several American generals actually wrote letters in writing to who was then the head of the Israel Defense Forces and said, had you not done that in June 1981, this war would have looked very different. Because at the end of the day, what's the American president going to do retroactively? But we are talking about a step now from which there is no turning back. Zionism made the Jewish people a very clear promise. Back in 1897, when Herzl gathered all the people together in Basel in the First Zionist Congress, and for the first time in 2,000 years, people gathered in one place and purported to speak for the entire Jewish people. And the premise of the First Zionist Congress was Europe is becoming uninhabitable. It can only go south. Little did they know in 1897 how far south it could go. And the premise was we're going to go back to our ancestral homeland and we're going to build something there. What kind of a thing we didn't agree about, religious or secular, capitalist or socialist. There were a lot of disagreements. But that we would be free and secure was always part of the assumption. That getting to Israel fundamentally meant that you would be secure, because Jews could keep themselves safe. So even in the war of 48, which is really 47 to 49, which was a devastating war for Israel, we won, but 1% of the civilian Jewish population of Israel was killed. In the United States today, that'd be some 3.6 million people. That's a lot of people. But Israel proved that it could keep its people safe. In 1967, most public parks in Israel were dug up, and tens of thousands of graves were consecrated by the chief rabbinate, because that was the expectation of what was going to happen to the civilian population. None of them got used. Because once again, we proved that Israeli boys could keep their parents and their siblings safe. And in 1973, you can be caught completely off guard, but because, as Golda Meir put it, we have a secret weapon, which is that we have nowhere else to go. Eventually, those boys clawed their way back to the lines from which it had started and made it so clear to the Arab world that there was going to be no defeating Israel, that 4 years later, Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem, and he and Begin eventually made peace. And the Second Intifada could turn Israel into a hellhole, and buses could blow up, and restaurants could be uninhabitable, and kids would have nightmares, and all of that. But you couldn't bring down a country by blowing up buses. There was never a question during the Second Intifada, as horrible as it was, that Israel was going to collapse because of this. It was going to make life miserable, and it did, but it wasn't going to bring down the Jewish state. Except for the first couple of days of the Yom Kippur War and the first couple of months of the War of Independence, there has never been a period in Israel's 67-year history where there was really a question of whether or not the Jewish state was going to survive. And now, the entire Western world, in collusion with Washington, D.C., is preparing to allow a reality that would restore Israel back to the very fragility of Jewish life that Jews left Europe in order to escape in the first place. We're told that it's a rational regime. They wouldn't want to be destroyed. How much do you and I want to bet on the rationality of their regime? The Nazis were losing the war. The Allies were closing in from the east and from the west, and the Nazis took desperately needed materiel and people and whatever else they had, and they used it to kill more Jews in Auschwitz rather than to defend their borders. Because ideology sometimes trumps reason. Does anybody in this room know for a fact that ideology is not going to trump reason when it comes to Iran? Anybody in this room willing to take the bet? I'm not. Most Israelis are not. You're not. And neither should America. We live in a world of sadness because it's a time in which too much of America has stopped believing in itself. Who says we're really better? Who says that America is exceptional? How do we know that our way of life is better than other ways of life? Well, you know what? It is. It actually is. This is the greatest country on the face of the earth. And it ought to take great pride in the values that make it great. And it ought to see as natural allies and as allies that it will defend at all costs those other countries that share America's values. There's a democracy and there's a non-democracy. Which one should be protected? There's a country that executes gays and lesbians, and there's a country that elects them to the Knesset. Which one should be protected? There's a country that throws you in prison for expressing views that are against the government, and there's a country that has one newspaper for every 3 citizens. Which one should be protected? There is a country that says that Zionism is an evil germ that needs to be eradicated, and another country that since the very, very advent of its Declaration of Independence has said, all we want is to make a deal with you. Which one should be protected? And if they get the bomb, and I remind you, by the way, that Clinton said North Korea was not going to get a bomb. Washington, D.C. does not have to help. It just has to be wrong about how hard it has to be to stop it. Clinton definitely did not want North Korea to get a bomb. Nobody ever accused him of that. Just underestimated the degree to which America had to make sure that it didn't happen. If they get it in 2015 or in 2017 or in 2021, and then the rockets start flying from Gaza again, and the rockets start flying from Lebanon, and Israeli kids in the heat of the summer are once again sleeping in bomb shelters. And Israeli kids who are 10 and 11 years old are once again wetting their beds. And child psychologists are not sleeping at all at night because all they're doing is treating groups of kids after groups of kids after groups of kids. And the entire country is hunkered down and can't function. And maybe once again the FAA will say, well, that's the most dangerous airport in the world. American carriers can't fly there and European carriers follow suit. And finally, it's unbearable because the economy can't sustain it, the citizenry can't sustain it, and all of a sudden the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and the artillery pieces start lining up along the Gaza border, start lining up along the Lebanese border, and then Iran says, no, 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 no. Either you pull them all back, or we're going to put a bomb in the New York harbor, in a shipping crate. You'll never find it. And you have 3 days to get your pieces away from the border. Anybody here have any doubt what Washington is going to say to Jerusalem, which, despite the Supreme Court, is in Israel? Anybody have any question? I don't either. This is not about sanctions or not sanctions. This is not about whether or not Israel is sugar and spice and all things nice and has moved the peace process forward fast enough. This is not about the optics of the current Israeli government, which you can love or really not love. It doesn't make any difference. All of those things matter deeply, but this is not about that. This is about, does the Western world believe that once again the Jews have to cower in fear? Does the Western world believe that once again Jews have to wait to be told by somebody else when it's time for them to die? This is about whether the Western world believes that once again, Israel should be put in a position that it can't defend itself because if Iran threatens America, there's not a way in the world America will let Israel defend itself. This is about whether the Western world is going to go now completely back on the Balfour Declaration and the vote of November 29th, 1947. That's what's at stake here. You know what's at stake here? Is everything. Just before we started, someone came up to me right at the table and reminded me of a piece that I wrote about a year ago, which I'd totally forgotten about, but I want to conclude with. Not far from my neighborhood in Jerusalem, where now, by the way, you hear a lot more French spoken than you ever did before, because Herzl was right, and Jabotinsky was right. Europe is sick, and it'll always be sick. And the neighborhood is actually improving in a lot of ways. The bakeries are a hell of a lot better. And while I really have to say, it is really nice to be able to finally, after 17 years of living in Israel, buy a good 7-layer cake and not have to bring it back from the kosher marketplace in the Upper West Side. Most Israelis come and they buy watches. They put them all the way up their arms here and they walk through customs. My big sin is I bring in 2 7-layer cakes. All right. I've always lived a very exciting life. But it's sad, actually, to hear the French. A gorgeous language and fabulous people, and it's great to have new immigration. But in 2015, people are fleeing again? Really? And it could actually get you to the point of saying this is never going to end. But in this neighborhood also, there's a little train track. The tracks were laid in 1933 by a private company that thought it could make some money by running a train track between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It actually did make a little bit of money. And over the course of the years, of course, the train tracks became completely disused. And not that long ago, a series of Jerusalem mayors, some of whom are in jail, some of whom will be in jail, turned the train tracks into really an unbelievably beautiful place to walk. And you go on a Shabbat afternoon in Jerusalem these days, when it's not cold anymore and it's not unbearably hot yet, and the train track and the line there is packed with hundreds, and over the course of the length of it, thousands of people, couples strolling hand in hand, and young parents pushing strollers, and elderly people with their grown-up kids pushing walkers slowly, and looking around. And by the way, Jewish couples and Muslim couples, because the train tracks go right through Beit Safafa. And in the morning when I go running there, you see young Arab women wearing hijabs with their iPhones and their earphones. It's great. And if you know the history of Jerusalem, you know that this thing which weaves right through Katamon weaves through the place in which the most bitter battles for Jerusalem were fought in the 1948 war. We go walking with our iPhones, and we go walking with our earbuds, and we go walking with all the things that we wear, nonchalantly just wondering how many more kilometers we can get to until we have to hit whatever little thing the Fitbit says we have to do. Through places where people died left and right in 1948. If those train tracks could only tell a story of what Jewish life was like in 1933 under the British, of what happened when the riots started in 1937, of the vicious battles in 1947 and 1948. If those train tracks could only speak, they would tell you how unbelievable it is that people stroll on Shabbat afternoon with their kids and with their parents, with their spouses, with their children, with their lovers, with their neighbors, and take it all for granted. It's important to remember that. Because in 1947, 1948, no one would have believed that that was possible. And it was. And there are a lot of people today who think that it's not possible to stop a bad deal, and it is. And there's a lot of people who think that there's nothing that can be done to make Israel able to defend itself. They're wrong. The world is filled with limitless possibility. Jewish spirit and Zionist passions can make things happen in ways that we never imagined. What we simply need at this moment now is courage. What we simply need at this moment now is clarity of moral thought. What we need now is profound historical awareness and great memory. Armed with those things and armed with the passion and the intelligence and the wisdom of the people in this room, we can make the change that needs to happen, happen. We can make the change that must happen because of what America has to stand for, happen. And because you are going to do what we all know you're going to do, you're going to ensure not only the legacy of the Jewish state, but the values that have made this country great as well. For all that you are about to save, God bless you. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.